So, I mean, I've introed you before you got here, but professor of English at the University of Illinois Chicago, has published a number of books, and then right, you also run, is it the what's it called, the critical humanities theory group or something in Chicago?
Yeah, it's called Intersect, the Inter-Chicago Circle for Experimental Critical Theory.
Awesome. Um, well, I want to talk a bit about your book that came out last year. I want to ask you a couple questions about I don't know, things that came up in reading it about what you're maybe pointing towards. But I want to start with one thing. This is a little self-serving, but I think relevant to others. Um, so I used to be an academic, but I've been at academia since 2017. A thing I'm very curious to talk to people about these days is to be like very crass slash blunt. Like, how bad is it these days from within the perspective of teaching at a university, especially teaching at a public university. A lot of my audience are current students, recent students, people considering grad school and things like that. So I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of perspective on what the recent years have been like from the belly of the beast.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the conditions are very diverse and it's widely various whether you're in a red state or a blue state, whether you're in a private school or a public school, how well funded your public school is, what kind of student body you have, all of those things. So we talk about higher ed a lot, and certainly we get like the insane kind of representation of higher ed in like the mainstream media, and none of that's really representative of either the places that the kinds of and the kinds of institutions where the majority of students go and the majority of faculty work, nor is it representative of this heterogeneity of experience. So just to sort of preface it with that, and to say like I teach in a public school, so that can be challenging, and it can be an under-resourced public school, but I teach in a blue state with a very good governor who's improved funding to higher education every year that he's been in office. Shout out to Big Boy Pritzker. So
We love Pritzker on this show. That's a real thing. So good to hear.
we'll talk about that later too. Uh, but so so that's really good. And then I also teach in an urban university, and so that means that students really want to be there, and faculty really want to be there because it's a dynamic place to be, not only because it's Chicago, the best city in the country, but because it's a city. And so schools that are in cities, might not be the regional flagships that have been land grants that are in college towns, right? But they have so much art and culture and internships and politics and so much going for them that there tends to be a lot of interest in being in those places in ways that kind of amplify the resource situation. So, I have a school that is serves the working poor. We have one of the largest concentrations of Pell eligible students of any country. But it's a R1, so it's federal grant prolific. It is research productive. There's an incredible amount of stuff going on campus. Of course, because we are serving the urban poor and grant prolific, we're in our own strange category that very few schools are in. It's going to be extremely difficult for us to absorb the unconstitutional theft of federal grant money. So that's just totally devastating. It's like a steamroller coming for us, even though we're otherwise a kind of booming place with, again, a supportive governor and an excellent city, and more and more students who want to be there than ever before. And that is one of the stories of college that is true, is that there are more people in college than ever before, right? And there are jobs in college that are just not equitably structured jobs. So, I don't actually know the exact conditions under which you left, and I'd love to hear about those. But it's hard to do this work as a student, as a contingent person, a faculty member without
Mhm.
security of employment, and that's who delivers the majority of instruction nationwide.
Yeah.
But it's also like, incredibly rewarding work to just pursue communal meaning making and knowledge and ideas and expertise, and to do that collaboratively. It's so I'm so lucky that I get to do that kind of work. And I should also say that across academia since the pandemic, we've seen it become one of the most union activist sectors
Love it.
the country. And so that's like incredibly, hopeful in a lot of ways that people realize more people being in college than ever before means that there are more people doing that work to support them than ever before. And those people need equitable working conditions. And also that universities provide health care, all over the country, right? We are the rural downstate clinics in Illinois or in Missouri or in California. It's provided by universities in a nonprofit basis, right? University hospitals. So, like, there's so much, kind of influencing how it's going on, and some of it is bad and some of it is good. So, yes, things are bad, but like they're also, people are fighting everywhere they are, and people are hungry for knowledge everywhere they are, and those are good things.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Yeah, like I taught as a visiting assistant in my last job in the States, and obviously I adjuncted for a bit too, so I've had that experience of being in, like, a precarious faculty member, knowing what that's like economically, but I never had the experience of ever feeling like my curriculum would be under attack or that I could get in trouble. And, I used to teach, well, I had to teach like business ethics for a while and did like a Marxism segment to these kids from Baltimore that were about to go like move to New York to work on the stock market. And they were cool with it. They weren't getting mad at me and I wasn't in trouble there. But I ended up in the UK because it was
Uh-huh.
the only place I could find like a tenure track position.
Right.
Um, but while I was there, it was like a level of neoliberalization, which was kind of shocking, and the way that management took over the university. And I worked at a former polytechnic university in the UK, so ones that like started in the 80s and 90s were largely for working class students. And when I left, we were things were happening like we had a second year philosophy course on Kant's third critique that we were asked to include a segment on where we taught students how to work on resumes for jobs.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Those two
and
things are
then yeah, really related stuff.
yeah.
And then they rolled out a thing as well that would evaluate our department and determine future research funding on the basis of students that graduated with a philosophy degree having a full-time job within a year of graduation, but only certain jobs applied.
Yeah.
Uh, and because of the way things go in the UK, a lot of students will take a year off before they pursue postgraduate study.
Yeah.
So we had all these great students that would finish and maybe go work in a pub or a cafe for a year while getting ready to go to grad school, but they like didn't count. So that actually was a mark against our success. So yeah, it was like stuff like that. The more kind of crass neoliberal logic was the stuff I'd experienced, but
Right.
not things I've heard from friends in academia recently. Like you have to be, I have I won't name them, but a friend who teaches in the Philadelphia area who at one point expressed fear about like, what if I say the not even the wrong thing, but something in a course that involves Marxist theory that some
Mhm.
student films or writes down and I
Mhm.
get attacked online for being unwoke or something like that. So that sounds just very unnerving from a faculty perspective to even have to like think that stuff. And then to know that there might not be support for you, higher up for those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And I think that's again what I mean about the heterogeneity of the experience is that, like,
Yeah.
what if they do you have labor protections in the workplace?
Mhm.
Like I have a kind of long standing at this point, a mature faculty union. We're united, tenure track and non tenure track. We extend the same
That's
rights
great.
to our contingent faculty.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah. So like my workplace conditions are very different than what a lot of people would be working under. And those imperatives of surveillance on the one side,
Mhm.
and kind of the right wing conspiracy culture of making lists of professors, all of these things on one side. And then on the other side of just quantification and metrics and the kind of ill fit between the models that the consultancies are selling the governments in these like ref works, kind of calculation matrices, which are, by the way, software that then the university is spending a lot
Yeah.
of money on and stuff like that, instead of putting that money into their core mission of instruction, right? That those calculations are also all like incredibly ideological. Like we know that there's a very large campaign, and I've worked on a counter campaign to this, to misrepresent the job prospects of people who study liberal arts subjects or people who major in humanities subjects. If you go to humanitiesworks.org, you can get some real facts to dispute some of these misrepresentations. But there are moneyed interests that don't want the populace to be educated and don't want them to come out with critical degrees. That's true. There are those same interests that want to surveil professors and want to create these right-wing harassment campaigns where freedom of inquiry and freedom of thought is placed under incredible, straits, and it's very terrible. Yeah. So
Yeah.
those just one quarter of some of the dynamics that go on. Absolutely.
Ooh. Well, something I'm curious, and I guess like the thing I've experienced recently in my work of making things on the internet is that there is a pretty deep desire for a lot of folks to have access to what I guess we could call in broad terms the critical humanities, and the tools of those sorts of thinkers to help them understand stuff in the world. And my pet project recently, and I'll circle back to this later, um, has been sort of injecting some Frederic Jameson stuff in work that I'm doing on YouTube. And I noticed that when it connects with people, there can be these moments that I like to think of as like, oh shit moments, where people are like, oh shit, that makes sense now. Or sort of the way in which theory helps people, I guess to be Jamesonian, like cognitively map or whatever, but see what's going on and understand it. And I've seen that in the years that I've been working in like digital media grow. At the same time, of course, as you just referenced, a lot of the programs that teach that sort of stuff at universities are being defunded and cut. But I do wonder, in your experience, like, have you noticed as like the uh, political and cultural world has gotten, for lack of a better term, worse in recent years, have you noticed like your humanities students having a different attitude or relationship towards the material and things you're talking about in classes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I just want to start by saying, like, thank you for doing this work. And I think you are part of a really big movement of people who are trying to carve out alternative media opportunities and alternative spaces for the fulfillment of this hunger for knowledge and hunger for ideas. And so I love that you're doing it. And I think that there's a whole really dynamic network of that, and it gives me so much hope and heart that even people who feel like priced out of higher education or
Yeah.
disillusioned by the debt and by institutional politics, or by like living in a state that is hostile for higher education, for instance, are still pursuing other kinds of alternative ways of learning things, including through live streams, including through YouTube and podcasts. And so I went to a conference recently that was all different kinds of cultural theorists, like film theorists and literary theorists and political theorists, rhetoricians, who were all interested in psychoanalytic theory. And there were a few hundred people who were mostly academics presenting at the conference. And then there were like 60 people who were registered to attend the conference who just were nerds who were excited by
That's so cool.
and all. Yeah, like they had come there for like vacation, and like
Yeah.
get their fix of psychoanalytic theory because they had had access to it through these kind of platforms that you yourself are producing. So thank you for
Yeah.
doing. There is so much
Wow.
people want ideas because it's who we are as human beings. I think that we're curious and playful, and learning is really fun. And all of the kind of bullshit that is coming down from the AI grifter overlords about like cutting out the thinking process and not ever reading and not ever writing is totally a control strategy, and it is an attack on that human core of how fun it is and how fulfilling it is to be involved in learning and curiosity and making meaning and collaborative conversation. So, what
Yeah.
I from my students, and again, I have a kind of unusual student population because they're extremely working class, but extremely high achieving, and they've made it into or been able to transfer into a research one university in an urban area. That is that they still love being an English major, despite all of the propaganda that they should be a computer scientist, let alone that Forbes will tell you that computer science is earning power for graduates is less than for English majors, right? But there's a propaganda machine. My students love ideas, and they want to be in those collaborative, sort of laboratories of idea making, idea generating, idea processing. And I think that the value of that kind of human endeavor does become more precious and more salient when we have everything around us is just slop, and everything around us is brutal violence.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe that's if you don't mind me asking some questions about things that come up in your most recent book, I feel like that's a good transition. And I know that your book Immediacy with Verso came out last year, and I also know that because it came out last year, you probably wrote it like 2 or 3 years ago. So sure you've done so much since then, but I mean, first of all, I'll just say, like, I remember it's a book I started reading a while back and then finally dug into. It's so good, and a thing I really like about it, because now that I'm not in academia anymore, it's changed the way in which I read kind of academic text, in which I'm not looking for like where's the quote I can use in the paper I want to write, or like where is the thing I can respond to. It's more just like, is this an enjoyable thing that makes me think in a way that feels valuable in and of itself? And the thing I often think about as well is like when I read texts that are vaguely academic these days, is like what can I recommend to people in my audience and community that's worth their while and doesn't just feel like, a collection of journal papers. Um, and interesting that it touched on a lot of stuff that is very thinky and things where I had to like highlight a passage and reread it, but also stuff that felt so incredibly relevant to spaces like this, like YouTube, and how we think about the way we consume, produce, and interact with content. But maybe the most, if I can ask you this, I'm sure you've answered this a bazillion fucking times in the last couple of years, but for the audience here, can you maybe just describe what you mean, or what your basic understanding is of immediacy as you use it in this work?
Sure. So, when most of us use it, and people love to use it to describe also like social media relations,
Mhm.
speed and immersion and instant relay, right? Like that there's no barriers, right? That stuff is just happening, that it feels very connected, right? And I'm interested in how those feelings relate to a kind of broader effort to um, actually cut out the work of connecting, or actually kind of attack things like representation, language, the deliberate processing of bridges between people or between ideas, and about how that cutting out of representation, or that kind of what I call like an intolerance or impatience with get it, like it's got to be accessible and I got to get the message and it's got to be a DM and it's got to be on demand, like that, all of that we sort of might come to understand as like a kind of attitude about how we consume information or what we expect of entertainment or art, that's actually kind of conditioned by a broader economic framework where a lot of our sources of profit from our big companies are coming not from making things but from delivering things,
Mhm.
right? So whether that's Amazon Prime and same day delivery, or on demand streaming services, or instant access to um, other kinds of like personal chauffeurs, right? Or whether that is the kind of broader field of just-in-time logistics, whether that's high frequency trading and the kind of financial markets, that we have an incredible premium on speed, on instant transfer, and on exchange, as opposed to on making and production, and let alone like slowness or process.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to situate some of these kind of like attitudes about art and information and styles of art and information in this broader economic context, and thinking about where the sources of profit have been in the G7 economy since the 1970s. So that's sort of, and that's just the kind of cutting out of mediation or cutting out
Mhm.
of the middleman. Like that's what Uber's business model is, right? That's kind of what I'm thinking through in the book.
Yeah, and then I know, like, we can think about mediation in the I guess the more um classically Marxist sense of the way in which value is produced or whatever. But I think some of the examples you use, and maybe some of the stuff that's potentially relatable to folks that haven't gone down those rabbit holes, is some of the examples you use in the book about the way we consume media and art seem to get at this idea that there was once a time where, whether it was visual art, film, literature, art was constructed or art was presented to us where there was a sort of space between us and the work itself that gave us the possibility of negotiating meaning, and I guess like subjectively relating to the thing.
Mhm.
um, but you kind of get at the idea that our experience of art now, and you can correct this if it's wrong, is so immediate that there's not really room for the negotiation of meaning. There's not really room for us to subjectively relate to the thing or consider the things ourselves. It's just the thing, like, is the thing, and then we keep it moving.
Yeah, I think that's some of it. And so there's a
Yeah.
couple, uh, uh, kind of aspects to that question. So one is, do we have room not just for our subjective experience of the thing, and for the thing in and of itself, but also for the interaction, for the
Mhm,
process, for the idea that you might actually need the plaque on the wall at a museum to help provide some context for you, or that when you look at a kind of cool contemporary work of art in a gallery or watch a TV show, that it you might not get it right away, that it
mhm,
might
mhm, mhm,
rewatching and it might be worth talking through with people, that meaning is opaque and is
mhm,
collaboratively generated, or that artworks aren't efficient DMs, they're not an
mhm,
efficient
mhm.
way to communicate, right? So I think it's less that there's a kind of winnowing away of subjective experience, because in a lot of senses it's subjective experience that takes over the kind of
Mhm.
objective relationality between the same
Yeah.
communities of meaning makers. Um, it's also important to note that I'm trying to describe a specific sort of style of artworks and cultural products, and of attitudes towards artworks and cultural products in a specific time period, but that various kinds of excitement about, or demand for, or threat from the possibility of immediacy have attended like art since the dawn of time. Right, so like
Mhm, mhm,
Plato is concerned about representation that hides
mhm,
itself, or the kind of possibility that we can be in the presence of something and do away with words and have a profound, say, spiritual or corporeal response to it. That attends all kinds of, cultural ecstasy and religious ecstasy and human expression, for millennia. But to me, the thing that is very specific about our time right now is the absolute kind of convergence of that possibility that artworks kind of, um, you know, uh, obviate their own representation or produce something that's so intense in us that it defies words and is only kind of, it is what it is, and I am what I
mhm.
feel. The convergence of that framework with this like instant access on demand economy, the
Yeah.
hamster crime is like, that is just a too closeness about this logic of art, with our logic of economic value, that makes it harder for the art to be critical of the economic
Mhm,
value.
mhm.
And that's what
So, yeah, I wanna follow up on that then by asking then, and this is something you talk about in the book a bit, and this is me again trying to maybe adapt it to a slightly different context, but it seems like what you're getting at is that in the past, and this even makes me think of, like, Jameson postmodernism stuff, that, you know, economic conditions shaped types of culture and output, but in ways where, like, it's not the thing itself, or it's not, there's still, like, a gap there. I'm being slightly inarticulate here, but
Mhm.
it seems like what you're getting at is, rather than it being a set of things where, like, culture is representing at a remove an economic system or logic, that this sort of immediacy is just that logic. It's like the pure thing itself. And,
Yeah.
and what it made me think about when I was reading that with like my YouTube brain is, and I don't know much how you know about like the worst parts about YouTube, but like, do you know who Mr. Beast is?
Oh, a little bit. Yeah.
I'm so sorry that you do. My
Yeah.
favorite thing in the world is to ask that question and for someone to say no, and then for me to say, keep it that way. But the thing that shocked me when I first became aware of that type of content, which is the most popular thing on this platform, is that kind of replicates the worst aspects of our economic logic, where a video starts and a guy is immediately yelling at you, and the stakes of the thing are people are going to compete in dehumanizing competitions to get an insane amount of money, and obviously that money will change their lives, and then we're going to watch the brutal interactions of people
Mhm.
as they jump through hamster wheels to try to make an amount of money necessary to survive. And it's
Right.
very much just like a heightened brutalist version of what it means to exist
Right.
today.
Right.
So I guess in a less extreme extent than that, is part of it that the logic of immediacy in popular culture means we're just getting the thing, or sort of being confronted with the pure logic of whatever capital is right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, right? So, as you point out, Jameson is interested in, and this is a kind of perennial Marxist question. It's one of the real innovations that Marx has in trying to think about art, right? Is like, what's the relationship between the stuff that we do that has no use and doesn't have direct
Mhm,
profit? So, our creative representations and the stuff that we make up, right? Our fictions, our stories, and our sculptures and our paintings, and the economic system, right? Because there's not no relationship, but how causal is that relationship? And the thing I am concerned about, Jameson articulates this very well in the postmodernism book, is that there is a kind of closing of the gap between the artwork and the commodity
mhm.
object. Right. The artwork was specifically articulated as a non commodity object by the advent of capitalism, the advent of the marketplace, the ability for artists to not just be, hired by patrons and so on, their ability to sell their work, that is the condition for thinking, oh, but art is autonomous from commodities or different from commodities. But then postmodernism, a lot of how Jameson defines it is just like a total kind of permeation of the artwork by the logic of the commodity, or a total saturation of everything in culture by marketing. And what is even worse than postmodernism is this kind of Mr. Beast brutality, right? The just spectacle and the kind of one up of the dopamine that you have to do.
Mhm.
You keep transgressing that. It has to keep being more degraded. It has to
Yeah.
keep being more abject and more disgusting, right? And many of the things that we consider sort of like high culture right now are equally Mr. Beastly in their pursuit of that degradation and that intensity. And that's some of what I mean by immediacy, that there's this profundity of bodily abjection and
Mhm.
suffering and kind of extreme affects. And there's not a kind of intervening kind of screen distance or of the symbolic, or representation to kind of like, modulate that intensity.
Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of the emphasis you put on the rise of, I guess, the immediate in writing and both like fiction and nonfiction writing. Um, you talk about memoirs and first person writing and the way in which there's this sort of immediate communication of the individual experience in the written form. And this is something again that appeals to the stuff I think about because so much of like there's been a shift if you look at the culture of a lot of like YouTube and digital video stuff that a lot of the things that are more popular than ever are people who are seemingly offering that really raw first person immediate here's my lived experience right at you no filter type thing so why is that something that you associate with this phenomenon how does and I think because I think a lot of that stuff in a sense might read to us initially as very not anti-capitalist, but like decommodified. It's just someone's authentic lived experience. It's the writer telling me exactly what she feels. So this is maybe good or this is more human or whatever it might be. So how does that still fall into this logic?
Yeah, that's such a good, important question. So I think you're totally right that our ability to assess what is emancipatory or what is radical is very bound up with this question of authenticity, of confessionalism. Here, even we are like doing the vertical video, right? Like, and I'm trying to
Yeah.
look into the eyes of whoever, if you, right, this whole kind of format of the talking head and the expressive, charismatic persona, that is a very historically specific idea of what authenticity is or what liberatory representation is, right? And one of the things that is a kind of occasion for the argument in the book, and one of the big cultural historical points that I try to make in the book, is that this specificity of that framework, it accounts for like a really radical mutation in the history of the English novel. So the novel, people haven't been writing novels forever, right? They've been writing poetry forever since there was human writing, but the novel is a very specific form. It only arises with capitalism. We've only had novels for a few hundred years. For the majority of those few hundred years, so for like its 300-year history, the vast majority of texts published in English as novels have been composed in the third person. And that's true when there's a very small number of novels being published in the early novel market in like the early 18th century, right? And that is true in the middle of the 20th century. And this is stuff that I provide kind of computational cultural analytics for and graphs of in the book, right? What happens in the late 20th century and what is this overwhelming mutation in the 21st century is that all of a sudden the novels are being written in the first person in ways that outnumber the third person, right? The first person is dominant in the English novel for the first time. And this is an extraordinary change of 300 years. So, like, how can we explain that, right? And so that's one of the questions the book is trying to answer. Like, why is it that these logics of confessionalism and personalism and authenticity are so resonant at this moment, right? But what the other thing that I'm trying to explore is what is it that we lose when we have um, uh, texts that are presenting themselves as sort of novels, right? But that are really invested in the idea that they are anti novels, that they are getting out of the
Mhm.
trappings of fiction, that they are cutting out all the bullshit of representation, that they are just truth speaking, right? Why is there this militancy that accompanies so much of this rhetoric of authenticity that is about like there can't be any characters, there can't be any metaphors, everything is true, everything is the most debased possible thing I can share about my bodily experience. I'm not going to have other characters because it's some kind of injustice if I represent other people. And so there's this just over attack on fictionality and on the cool things that fictionality has offered to human expression, for 300 years, right? Like that we can actually get out of our stupid meat envelope bodies and like think about what other people might be thinking or experience consciousness from the point of view of somebody very different from us,
Mhm.
right? Or even more than that, third person narration is not a kind of consciousness any of us get to experience. It's something more than experience. It's something different from experience. And isn't that cool? Like, we're stuck in our experience all day long. Like, isn't it good to learn things that stretch your mind beyond
Mhm.
that? And so there's a renunciation of all of those capacities of fictional art in this like ideological movement against third person representation. And it's not just that this is like, you know, authentic and legitimate and somehow like say feminist or something.
Yeah. Well, and then another thing you talk about is narcissism in the book, and I think that attaches to this because I think another way that some of us might think of, whether it be the shift towards the first person essay as such a dominant form of communication or video vlog, all this sort of stuff. Um, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, everyone's just a narcissist now. And as you get into in the book, there's lots of kind of not that good arguments and studies that get at this sort of stuff. So why was it important for you to differentiate this phenomenon from simply just being, hey, everyone's narcissistic now?
Oh, thank you for that so much. It's important to me because I don't think that's a sufficient explanation, right? You can say that, certain kinds of moral observers, certain kinds of medical observers can say that they think we have a narcissism epidemic, but psychological dispositions and psychological symptoms are created in dialogue with cultures and with the kind of specific habits and values and customs and modes of representation in any given culture. And I don't think that it's very explanatory to just be like, oh, people are just degenerating and suddenly there's a narcissism epidemic. Everybody's
Yeah.
bad, selfish, and that's natural. Like any time that there's an appeal to nature, right? Like, oh, our inner nature as narcissists is just coming out because we can take too many pictures of ourselves or something like that. Like anytime there's an appeal to nature, you're usually in the realm of ideology, right? And what is sort of like mystified by the claim of narcissism epidemic is what are the broader kind of determinants of narcissistic behavior? Well, it turns out the four biggest companies in our economy are data companies. They,
Mhm.
think that they generate value from information and impressions and things that are capturable and quantifiable that then they sell to each other as like how to market other things. And there is an incentive for them to have us be manifestive as much as possible, right? To post 30 times a day or to take as many pictures on Instagram as possible or whatever, because that's their business model. And I think that you can't talk about something like the moral situation or the libidinal situation without talking about that broader cultural
Mhm.
matrix. And indeed, that's how Freud would do it. That's how Lacan would do it, you know.
Yeah. Um, so I think that question, gets at the way in which often by shifting to an obsession with psychological states or individualistic attitudes, it gets us away from thinking about structures and economic situations. So I do want to talk a little bit about the role of politics in the book and the politics of immediacy in particular. And I found that really convincing and also uncomfortable because you do a thing in the book that's great where there's things I was reading or I had to do the thing where it's like, oh shit, I do that. And I think part of that is the way in which what it means to quote unquote do politics or be political, especially for younger folks right now, is so tied up in a reactivity and immediacy in which we want everything to be spontaneous or organic or relative to a quote unquote social media movement. And I don't want to step on your toes, so I'll say this and I want to hear your thoughts on this, but you do then set that up in contrast to political organizations, labor unions, the state. Um, so maybe if you don't mind, just say a little bit about how this plays into our experience of the political and our ability to sort of be political and organize politically.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think you characterized it very well that there's a sense that we're doing politics when we're expressing ourselves, not that we're doing politics when we're building coalitions
Mhm,
or
mhm, mhm,
acting solidarity or strategic planning or having a goal and working towards it and winning. There's a lot of addiction to losing because that is aggrandizing for the purity of the individuals and for the kind of untouchability of like, well, I had the right politics, but I couldn't sully myself with something like a rank and file hierarchical structure where there are bargainers of the union or
mhm,
presidents of the union who do bad things, right? And I think there's just an incredible reflexive antipathy to formalized organization in progressive and left
mhm,
circles. It's anti party, it's anti union, it's anti state, it's these kind of anarchic fantasies of spontaneity and formlessness, and ways also of romanticizing what democracy is. That instead of it being like needing to have some fairly codified procedures for how you accomplish deliberation that then implements its programs, and how you kind of actualize a pluralism that is tolerant, for instance, that instead you have this just romanticized democracy of we never have to assent to somebody else's vision. It's
mhm,
just, I'm just doing me, right? And I choose, and I'm the individual sovereign. So I think there are long legacies, both in political theory and in political practice, of this kind of anti organizational thinking. And I think it's really not served progressives in the United States, certainly, and I don't think in other contexts either. There's some interesting anthropological and journalistic work on that, because we just constantly have the beautiful soul untainted by the dirty work of winning. And
mhm,
we have an antipathy to power, right? We think that power is tainted and that collective sovereignty is bad, and that if we wield power or construct things, that that's bad, and that it's just burn it all down is the only kind of ethos that's legitimate, right?
mhm.
There's kind of what you could call in German a Bildverbot, but like a prohibition on making plans, on
Yeah.
saying, here's what we could win if we do this together, right? And I think that some of the tide is turning a little bit on this. I mean, I absolutely love that, like, there are positive, affirmative, pro social policy propositions being made by people like Mamdani, right?
Yeah.
Here's what we don't have to live this way. Like, we can have nice things. We can have free lunch at school, and we can have free school, and we can have free transportation, and we can have policies that work for everybody. We can have more accessible housing, things of that nature, affirmative visions that people have to buy into. I don't know if you saw that in social media the last few days. There's been some debating by transit people and housing people and urbanists about like, oh, free buses actually isn't the policy we should
Yeah.
have, right? You know, that you want to have enhanced ridership and enhanced schedules and frequency, and those cost money. And so free isn't the demand. It's like, no, just get on board with this demand. Like, you know, because that's, we have to win this thing. Like,
Mhm.
and so there's just sort of the detractive refinement particularist ethos of like, let me have the right position that is sufficiently qualified, that is by myself over here in the corner and that doesn't align with, you know, your corrupt party interests or something like that. And that whole attitude I think of as immediatist insofar as it's about rejecting the necessary formalized ways of winning power, of scaling power, of articulating demands and slogans and buying, you know, and repeating them and holding them.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think. So in my past life as somewhat of a real academic, I worked on Soren Kierkegaard,
Mhm,
and obviously someone who writes about immediacy quite a bit in this, different context, more connected to romanticism and idealism, but still some similar stuff there. And I'm working on a thing right now for a video I'm making on one of his short essays called "The Present Age." I don't know if you've ever read it.
mhm,
Talks about immediacy a lot, but it's actually one of the best things he wrote. One of the few things he writes as Soren Kierkegaard, so it's not pseudonymously authored. But he sort of contrasts his age, and he calls it the age of reflection with an age of passion or action. It makes this point that in his day, everyone wants to just like believe the right slogan or sit around. And there's an analogy he uses for a story where he's like, everyone wants to go to the rally to plan the next revolution. And when they all agree on the right slogan, they go home and have a good night's sleep. The just being that you can get caught up in this cycle of reflecting on the language one uses or the sloganeering more so than wanting to do anything in society and the sort of necessary risk inherent in doing something.
yeah,
And I was thinking about Kierkegaard in your book because he, has the theory of indirect communication, precisely aiming at breaking one out of immediacy.
yeah,
Um, but
yeah.
yeah, but that's just to do Kierkegaard's soapbox for 2 seconds.
I that I'll go do some homework.
It's yeah, well, the one thing, the present age, very, very short, lovely piece. So maybe to wrap up the book discussion then, and I'll make sure I get you out of here on time. You seem like you're enjoying your summer holiday, and summer in the Midwest is as good as you can get. So I want you to be able to enjoy that.
Yeah.
I know I have 2 more weeks here in LA until I head to the Midwest for a couple weeks, and it cannot come soon enough.
Uh-huh.
Um, but so okay, so this is the subtitle of the book, and the thing you get into is this notion of too late capitalism. And of
Mhm.
course, it brings to mind, to do the Jameson thing again, late capitalism. So can you say a little about what you mean by that and why you chose the language of too late capitalism to describe
Yeah.
what you're doing here?
So some of it is just kind of a joke, which is like, you know,
Yeah.
late capitalism is a term that like is on HBO's Girls or whatever. Like everybody can say it, like, you
Yeah.
know, am I depressed or is it late capitalism? Right? It's like practically a meme, and it's been a term of art for over 100 years, right? Like, what can it actually mean if we're still 100 years going, right? It's not necessarily a description of a system on its last legs, right? It might be advanced, but so I was trying to mark that we might be beyond that 100 years, that we might be in something else, and more so that we might need some different ways of talking about
Mhm.
periods and about longevity of capitalism. So I do mean too late in the sense that like it's just zombie and it's not going away and it's killing us, right? Um, but I also mean it in the sense of we're definitely in something different than a bunch of the other cultural observers and historians have been trying to name when they use late capitalism, and so specifically Jameson. And so Jameson himself, you know, uses postmodernism to describe cultural production from, you know, the 1960s, but the mid 1970s onward. And he already says, you know, by 2015, we're not in that anymore. There have been a
Mhm.
number of efforts to try to figure out what are we in if it's not postmodernism. So a little bit I have this just kind of joke about like, well, things are still a lot of what they are in postmodernism, but some things are different, right? There's an intensification, there's an extremization of a bunch of postmodern tendencies, but there's also a reversal of a number of them. So too late is kind of like the pithy way to sort of say like we're in a different period, or this is an exercise in cultural periodization that is different. It's also a kind of nod to the debates about doomerism with regard to
Mhm.
climate, and the kind of temporal confusions that we find ourselves in, that we are living with a very foreclosed future, right? People, that's part of what it means to have an epidemic of depression, but it's part of what it means that we're having extinction forced upon us by our petro oligarchs, that our future is looking shitty. It's looking like little baby girls washed away at a summer camp, like
Mhm. Yeah.
by the hundreds, right?
Yeah.
And that's just in one town in our rich country, right? This is what it looks like: futurelessness, mass death, right? And that reverberates in the kind of sense that the present is all we have, that immediacy also speaks to, right?
Mhm.
Just like the presence is just the thing, and there's no ability to think ourselves into a future. We don't have a good plan for the future. There's also the temporal problem of lot of climate shit is baked in already, right?
Yeah.
Carbon that we let out of the ground and burned into the atmosphere decades ago is what's shaping our situation today. So even if we suddenly stopped everything today, no more billionaires, no more private planes, no more Hummers, right? Among other things, there would still be just so much calamitous effect of that. So our ability to think about temporality, the future, historicity is all kind of like messed up. And so Too Late is kind of just a little effort to, in a pithy way on the cover, get at some of those weird temporal problems that we're confronting.
Yeah. And I do think, I mean, and obviously that what you speak to is the most horrifying part of thinking the present is, digging into the thought of the present, the way in which the present does seem to sort of foreclose a real thought of the future sometimes. However, this book and some of your other work, and in a way that does, in a very positive way, remind me of Jameson's work, in that it both paints a unflinching picture of where we're at without seeming to fall into the doomerism that you described there. And book's kind of funny too. The thing I like about this with this, like 80% of my highlights are things that are deep and interesting, and then the other 20% are just like very funny lines. So I didn't know academics were allowed to do that. So good for you. Let me maybe end with this then. How much then do you and again, I can't help that Jameson is on the brain. We're starting a Jameson reading group with my community, so I'm very much in
Yes.
that headspace right now. But it's hard to not see in this book, at least, a sort of like continuation in your own way, in a very original style. That's very much you, but a sort of like continuation of a kind of Jamesonian project or something like that. Would that, I guess, like, would that be fair to say? And if so, what does that look like for you? Or what does it mean to kind of work in that tradition?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think that's totally fair to say. I don't think that we all have to figure out how to be new. I
Mhm.
think that he solved some incredible methodological problems about how we think about the interrelationship between culture and economics. And we should all just keep doing the kind of work that he's doing, because we have different cultural objects before us. We have a different historical situation that is sort of like limiting what we can say in the classroom, or limiting or shaping how we think about political strategy. And we have different economic sources of value, different economic sources of profit. So um, I absolutely feel like it's great to just continue in the tradition of Marxist cultural theory.
Mhm.
And that's also one of the kind of riposte that I'm making to a lot of the theoretical works of immediacy that I'm describing in the book, which we don't have to go into for your audience, but there is this way that all of the confessionalism and
Mhm.
degradation, anti-representation that we see in contemporary art and literature and television is also reflected in academics who, instead of writing works of history or theory or philosophy, are writing, memoirs about
Yeah.
they have cancer, right? These very abject and degraded, corporeal, anti-conceptual, and part of this huge boom in the sales of memoir, right?
Mhm.
So I am trying, instead of just like telling my story as my special snowflake about my interesting body, which is also boring to me, like I am trying to work in a tradition. I'm trying to uplift that tradition and be continuous with it, right? Marxist cultural interpretation is something that it starts with Marx, that has like incredible elaboration by people like Lukács and Adorno and Raymond Williams, and that Jameson makes tremendous strides in, and we should just keep doing that kind of work. So yeah, I think it's totally fair. I mean, that doesn't mean that I achieve anything like what he achieves, and both his working conditions are very different from mine, and his like outlandish genius is just, irreplaceable. But I want to try.
Yeah, well, I mean, it genuinely comes across, and I got very excited, finally digging into that book because it just taps into so many things. So how about this last kind of very quick question? What are you kind of working on next? What's the next big project or thing that you're thinking about?
Oh, thanks for asking me that. I am writing a book now that's called Good Enough Art, that is about the problem of whether you can have such a thing as middlebrow culture when you don't have
Ooh.
middle class anymore. And so, like, what that looks like aesthetically. Usually, we think about the middlebrow as what the middle class consumes and as like not that interesting aesthetically. And so I'm trying to sort of spell out like, here are the aesthetic features of middlebrow art for the 21st century, and we actually should want to make it, because much like we have a loneliness epidemic and a kind of connectivity crisis and a loss of social infrastructure, we have a real loss of commonly held meaning, and
Mhm.
art and culture play a tremendous role in that. So I'm trying to play with that stuff.
That sounds great. I mean, I hope there's a call for the resurrection of the, you know, friend group based comedic sitcom that has monocultural applicability. I think that's what we need more than anything else.
I think monoculture is a bad thing, and I absolutely think that ensemble television and comedy is like crucial to this. And we need to have investment in producing culture. We can't have the private equity vultures destroy the
Yep.
writers that give us rom-coms or sitcoms. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Anna, thank you so much for taking the time. Like, genuinely appreciate it. And then they didn't send it to me yet, but for when I put the interview up as a separate video, hopefully I'll have a code then from Verso. So if folks want to order a copy of Immediacy, you get a little discount there. Why not? We like Verso. We like books.
Awesome.
Um, but thank you so much for taking the time. And
Yeah.
please get on with enjoying your Midwestern summer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, for reading, and for making this space for all of these people to engage with ideas. It's amazing. And I look forward to you coming to the Midwest
Oh yeah, can't wait. And then please come back on the show sometime. I'll bug you in the future.
anytime.